Welcome, dear listeners, to the English Globe, the channel where we explore world news, global politics, and international issues in simple English. I'm Adam, and I'm so happy to have you here today. Whether you are listening from Asia, Europe, Africa, or anywhere in the world, thank you for joining us. Our goal is not only to help you understand the world better, but also to help you improve your English while learning about real and meaningful topics. So, sit back, relax, and let's begin this learning journey together.
Hello everyone, I'm Julia, and I want to welcome all of you too. We are so excited to share today's topic with you because it connects language, politics, and global economics all in one place. Today, we are going to talk about a very interesting and important question. Why did Donald Trump sanction Russian oil? This topic is both political and educational, and we will explain it in a very simple and clear way so that every English learner can understand and learn new vocabulary from it.
That's right, Julia. Many people around the world have heard about sanctions, about Russia, and about oil, but they don't always understand what these words really mean or why countries use sanctions as a political tool. So today, we'll take a calm and balanced look at this issue. We will discuss what sanctions are, how oil markets work, and why Donald Trump, during his presidency and now in his political career, decided to use oil sanctions as a strategy against Russia.
Before we dive deep into the topic, we want to remind all our dear listeners to please support the English Globe. If you're enjoying our podcasts and learning something new, kindly take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support really helps us continue making high-quality English learning content about world affairs, economics, and culture.
Yes, your support means a lot. And please don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We have listeners from many countries, from India, Brazil, Egypt, the Philippines, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and even from small towns across Europe and America. It's always inspiring for us to read your comments and see how people around the world are using English to connect and learn together. So, write down in the comments which country you're from and what you think about today's topic. Why Trump sanctioned Russian oil? Do you think sanctions help in solving problems, or do they create more challenges? We would love to hear your thoughts.
That's a great question, Adam, because today's topic is more than just about politics. It's also about understanding how decisions made by big countries affect the global economy and even our daily lives. Oil is something that every country needs. It's used for transportation, electricity, and even producing many goods. When one country decides to sanction another country's oil, the effects can be felt all around the world. Prices can change, trade can shift, and sometimes even relationships between nations can become tense.
Exactly, Julia, and that's why this topic is perfect for English learners, because it's real, it's global, and it's something that connects us all. By listening to this podcast, you will not only understand the reason behind Trump's decision to sanction Russian oil, but also learn useful English words and expressions related to international politics and economics. For example, we will explain words like sanction, export, tariff, revenue, and global market in simple ways that you can easily remember and use in your own English conversations.
In this episode, we'll start with the background, how Russia became one of the world's largest oil producers, and why its oil exports matter so much to the global economy. Then we'll talk about what sanctions are and why the US uses them. After that, we'll look at the effects, how these sanctions impact Russia, other countries, and oil prices. But don't worry, we'll explain everything step by step, using simple English so that you can both learn and understand deeply.
We want this podcast to feel like a classroom and a conversation at the same time. A place where you can learn English naturally through real discussions. So if you are an English learner, try to focus on the way we speak, the phrases we use, and how we explain ideas clearly. Listen carefully, repeat some of the sentences in your mind, and pay attention to pronunciation and vocabulary. This is a great way to build your listening and speaking skills while also learning about world news.
That's a wonderful point, Adam. We believe learning English should never be boring. When you connect language with real-world topics, it becomes alive, interesting, and memorable. So, in this episode, even if the topic sounds complex, like Trump sanctioning Russian oil, don't worry. We will make it simple for you. By the end, you'll understand the whole story. What happened, why it happened, and what it means for the world today.
And remember, dear listeners, learning English is not just about grammar and vocabulary. It's also about understanding ideas and being able to talk about them with others. When you understand news like this, you can discuss it confidently with your friends, your classmates, or even in an interview. You'll sound smarter, more confident, and more globally aware. That's why every podcast we make on the English Globe connects English learning with real-world understanding.
That's beautifully said, Adam. So let's begin this exciting journey together. In this first part, we will build the background. We'll look at how Russia became a major oil power, how oil trade shapes world politics, and why this became such a big topic for Donald Trump's administration. By learning this, you will get both knowledge and language skills at the same time.
So once again, thank you for joining us today. Please like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share it with your friends who are also learning English. Let's learn and grow together. Now, let's start exploring our topic, why Trump sanctioned Russian oil, and understand how this decision influenced the world and what we can learn from it as English learners and global citizens.
Before we understand why Donald Trump decided to sanction Russian oil, we first need to understand the background. Russia is not just any country when it comes to energy. It is one of the world's largest producers and exporters of oil and natural gas. For many years, oil has been the heart of Russia's economy. It brings in billions of dollars every year and gives the Russian government strong financial power in the global market. To understand this, we can imagine oil as the blood that keeps the Russian economy alive and running.
That's right, Julia. When we talk about oil, we're not only talking about something that powers cars or airplanes. Oil is one of the most valuable resources on Earth. It affects transportation, manufacturing, electricity, and even the price of many goods we use every day. In simple words, when oil prices go up, almost everything becomes more expensive: food, travel, and even daily products. So, when a country like Russia controls a large share of the world's oil exports, it naturally becomes very powerful in the international economy.
Exactly, Adam. Russia has been one of the top 3 oil producers in the world for many years, along with the United States and Saudi Arabia. The country has huge oil fields, mostly in Siberia and other northern regions, and it exports its oil mainly through pipelines and ships to Europe and Asia. For a long time, countries in Europe depended heavily on Russian oil and gas because it was cheaper and closer than oil from other regions. This dependence gave Russia a strong influence over European energy security.
And this is an important point for our English learners to understand. In global politics, energy means power. When one country supplies another country with energy, especially oil and gas, it creates a relationship of dependence. The buying country depends on the seller to keep its economy running. So, when Russia sells oil to many countries, it not only earns money, but also gains influence. This influence becomes political power because if any country disagrees with Russia, Russia could reduce its oil supply and cause economic problems for that country.
That's why oil is not just an economic resource, it's a political weapon too. Countries that have large oil reserves often have more say in international decisions. Over the years, the global oil market has become like a big web. Every country is connected through energy trade. When one country changes its oil policy, the whole system feels it. For example, If Russia increases or decreases its oil exports, oil prices around the world can rise or fall immediately. This is what we call the global oil market reaction.
Yes, Julia. And to make it easy for our listeners, let's explain a few simple words here. Export means selling goods to another country. When Russia exports oil, it sells it to foreign buyers, and the money it earns is called revenue. Import is the opposite. It means buying something from another country. So, when Europe buys oil from Russia, it is importing oil. Sanction, which we'll talk about more later, means a kind of restriction or punishment placed by one country on another, usually to control or pressure it politically or economically.
That's a good language explanation, Adam. Now, let's go back to the bigger picture. Oil trade is a key part of world economics. Every day, millions of barrels of oil are bought and sold between countries. The price is usually set in US dollars, which means the dollar is the main currency of the oil market. This also gives the United States a lot of power. When the dollar becomes stronger, oil often becomes more expensive for other countries, and when the dollar becomes weaker, oil prices can fall. This connection between oil and the dollar is one of the reasons why energy and politics are so closely linked.
That's very true, Julia. Now, during the past 2 decades, Russia has built its economic strength mainly through oil and gas exports. It uses the money it earns from selling energy to fund infrastructure, pay for government programs, and support industries. But this also means Russia's economy is very sensitive to changes in oil prices. When oil prices drop, Russia's income also drops sharply. This makes the country vulnerable to any action, like sanctions, that targets its energy exports.
Yes, and this is exactly where the story of US sanctions comes in. The idea of sanctioning Russian oil did not come from one single event. It was part of a long-term political and economic struggle between the United States and Russia. Over the years, these two countries have often disagreed on many global issues, from international conflicts to trade rules. Each time tension increased, sanctions became a tool used by the US to reduce Russia's financial and political power. And because oil is Russia's biggest source of revenue, it was naturally the main target.
Let's also remember that Russia's oil exports are not only important for Russia itself, but also for other nations that depend on it. Many European countries, for example, relied on Russian oil for their factories, heating, and transportation. When any restriction or sanction is placed on that supply, those countries face big challenges. They have to find new suppliers, often at higher prices. This creates ripple effects, like waves, that spread across the global economy. And when oil prices change, everything else changes too. The cost of living, inflation, and even government budgets in different parts of the world.
That's right, Adam. So when Donald Trump decided to sanction Russian oil, it wasn't just a small political move. It was a major global event with economic consequences for many nations. But before we reach that moment in our story, it's important to understand how the world's oil system works. Oil is traded internationally through two main ways: contracts and spot markets. Long-term contracts allow countries to buy oil at fixed prices for months or years, while spot markets sell oil immediately at the current price. When sanctions enter this system, they disturb both sides, creating uncertainty and price changes.
This is a great chance to learn new vocabulary, dear listeners. The word pipeline means a large tube used to carry oil or gas from one place to another. Barrel is the unit used to measure oil. 1 barrel equals about 159 liters. Crude oil is the natural form of oil that comes directly from the ground before it's refined or processed into petrol, diesel, or jet fuel. Refinery is the place where crude oil is cleaned and turned into usable products. Understanding these words will help you follow this and many future podcasts about energy and economics.
Well explained, Adam. Now, let's talk a little about how Russia exports its oil. Most of Russia's oil goes through pipelines that connect it to Europe and China. Some of it is shipped by tankers to other countries. These pipelines, like the famous Druzhba pipeline and the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline, are extremely important because they are the main routes through which Russia earns money. If any of these routes are blocked or restricted due to sanctions, Russia immediately faces economic pressure. That's why energy sanctions can be such a powerful tool in global politics.
You're absolutely right. And that's what made Russian oil such a sensitive topic in U.S. foreign policy. By 2019 and 2020, there were already tensions between the two countries. The U.S. accused Russia of using its energy exports to gain political influence over Europe and other regions. The Trump administration saw this as a challenge to U.S. interests and global stability. So, to weaken Russia's position and limit its income, the U.S. decided to impose sanctions on companies and entities related to Russian oil exports. This move was presented as a way to protect global energy security and punish what the U.S. described as unfair or aggressive behavior.
But we'll talk more about that decision in the next part of our podcast. For now, let's summarize what we have learned in this section. Russia is one of the largest oil producers and exporters in the world. Oil is deeply connected to its economy and political power. The global oil market is like a chain. Every country is linked, and when one link changes, the others feel it. When Donald Trump's administration started to focus on Russian oil, it wasn't just about politics, it was about global economics, international trade, and power balance. Understanding this background helps us see why sanctions became such a powerful and controversial tool.
Exactly, Julia. And for our English learners, this section also introduced many useful words: export, import, pipeline, barrel, revenue, refinery, crude oil, and global market. These are key words you can use to describe not only this topic, but any economic or international issue in English. Try to remember them, and maybe even write them down in a notebook. Each time you learn a new real-world topic like this, your English vocabulary becomes stronger and more meaningful. Now that we understand how important oil is for Russia and for the global market, let's move forward and look at why the United States, under President Donald Trump, decided to sanction Russian oil. To understand this, we need to think about how countries use power in different ways. Some countries use their military strength, others use their technology or trade. But one of the most powerful tools in international relations today is economic sanctions. These are restrictions a government puts on another country to change its behavior or reduce its power without using weapons or war.
Yes, that's right, Adam. Sanctions are like economic pressure. Instead of fighting on the battlefield, countries fight with money, trade, and finance. When Donald Trump came into power, one of his main foreign policy goals was to put America first. He wanted to make sure the United States stayed strong in the world economy and didn't depend too much on countries that he thought were rivals, like Russia or China. His government believed that by sanctioning Russia's oil industry, they could reduce Russia's influence and protect American interests at the same time.
And this decision didn't happen suddenly. It came after years of tension between the United States and Russia. The two countries have had many disagreements about global conflicts, about cyber activities, and about influence in different regions of the world. Trump's administration believed that Russia's oil wealth gave it too much political and economic power. They saw Russian oil not just as an energy product, but as a source of money that could be used for actions the U.S. considered harmful to global stability. So, in simple words, the U.S. wanted to limit the money flowing into Russia by targeting its biggest income source, oil exports.
That's a key point, Adam. For our English learners, let's make this idea even clearer. When one country sanctions another, it can restrict things like trade, investment, or access to international banks. These actions make it harder for the targeted country to do business as usual. In the case of Russian oil, the US sanctions tried to make it difficult for Russia to sell its oil freely around the world. The goal was to make other countries and companies afraid of doing business with Russian energy firms. This fear, or hesitation, reduces Russia's profits and puts financial pressure on its government.
Exactly. The Trump administration called this strategy maximum pressure. It wasn't just about Russia. The U.S. used similar tactics with Iran, North Korea, and other countries that Washington viewed as threats. The main idea was to use economic tools instead of military force to achieve political goals. For example, instead of sending soldiers, they would block trade or freeze bank accounts. It's a modern form of power, one that can change economies without starting a war. And for English learners, this is a very useful concept: economic diplomacy, using money and trade to influence global decisions.
Yes, and the language of economics and politics often connects here. When we say to impose sanctions, it means to put them in place officially. When we say to lift sanctions, it means to remove them. During Trump's presidency, several executive orders were made to impose new sanctions on Russian oil companies, their leaders, and even foreign companies that helped Russia sell its oil. These measures were designed to send a strong message. The US was watching and was ready to use its financial system as a tool of power.
And one of the reasons this was possible, Julia, is because the US dollar is the main global trading currency. Most oil transactions are done in dollars. That gives the United States a big advantage. If the US government bans a company or a bank from using dollars or from using the American banking system, it becomes almost impossible for that company to do global business. This financial dominance is what makes US sanctions so powerful. Even if other countries disagree with them, many companies still follow the rules because they don't want to lose access to the dollar system.
That's a really good point, Adam. So when Trump sanctioned Russian oil, he wasn't only targeting Russia directly, he was also indirectly warning others. Any foreign company or country that helped Russia could also face US restrictions. This is what we call secondary sanctions. The goal was to cut off as many paths as possible for Russian oil to reach the world market. Trump's team argued that this would reduce Russia's ability to use oil money to support what they called unfriendly actions on the world stage.
For English learners, this gives us some great new vocabulary. Secondary sanctions mean sanctions that affect not only the main country, but also others who do business with it. Another important word is tariff. That's a tax placed on goods imported from another country. While tariffs and sanctions are not the same, they both change trade and can be used as tools of political pressure. In the Trump era, both were used frequently: tariffs for trade disputes and sanctions for foreign policy. This combination made his approach very aggressive economically, but still within political and legal limits.
That's right. And to understand Trump's reasoning, we have to look at his bigger philosophy. He often said that the US should not be taken advantage of by other nations. He wanted fair trade, strong borders, and independence in energy. Under his government, the US became one of the world's largest oil producers. This made it easier for him to push other countries like Russia, because America was no longer as dependent on foreign oil as before. Sanctioning Russian oil was not only a political move, it also gave the US energy companies a competitive advantage in the global market.
Exactly, Julia. This is a key connection between economics and politics. When the US reduces Russian oil in the market, there's less competition for American oil producers. That means more chances for US companies to sell their oil and gas abroad. So, while sanctions are often explained as political or moral actions, they also have clear economic benefits for certain industries. That's why, in global politics, every move usually has more than one reason behind it: a political reason, an economic reason, and sometimes even a symbolic reason.
You're absolutely right, Adam. And for our listeners, this is a good time to reflect on how world politics often affects everyday people. When sanctions are applied, they can change oil prices, which can change the cost of transportation and energy. Even people far away from the US or Russia can feel the effect. This shows how interconnected our world is. Every international decision, especially in energy or finance, creates a chain reaction across countries and economies.
Yes, Julia. And that's why understanding these topics is so useful for English learners. When you read international news in English, you'll often see words like sanction, embargo, restriction, revenue, or policy. These words describe actions that shape how countries interact with each other. For example, in news reports, you might read sentences like, "The United States imposed new sanctions on Russia's energy sector," or "Oil prices rose after restrictions on Russian exports." These phrases are part of global English, and by learning them, you improve your language and your world knowledge at the same time.
Exactly. And if we look at Trump's time in office, we can see that he often used sanctions not only as punishment, but as negotiation tools. He believed that strong economic pressure could bring other countries to the table and make them agree to US terms. Whether it was Russia, China, or Iran, the message was the same: do business fairly or face consequences. This approach created a lot of debate. Some people supported it, saying it made America stronger. Others criticized it, saying it made relationships more difficult. But no matter what, it clearly changed the way global diplomacy worked.
And that's the part we want our listeners to focus on: how global diplomacy uses economic tools today. For many years, power meant having the biggest army or the strongest weapons. Now, power also means having financial control, trade influence, and the ability to set global rules. The Trump sanctions on Russian oil are an example of that shift, using money and markets instead of missiles and tanks. It shows how modern politics works in a connected world.
Beautifully said, Adam. So to summarize, the US perspective behind Trump's sanctions was shaped by several goals. First, to weaken Russia's economic influence. Second, to show American strength and leadership in global energy. Third, to support US oil companies by reducing competition. And fourth, to send a signal to the world that the United States could use its financial system as a peaceful but powerful weapon. Whether people agree or disagree with this strategy, it has become a major part of how modern international relations function.
That's right, Julia. And as we continue this podcast, we'll explore how these sanctions actually worked in practice, what rules were made, which companies were affected, and what results they had. But before we move on, we hope our listeners remember the main idea of this section. Sanctions are economic tools used to create political change. They may sound complex, but their goal is simple: to pressure one country by reducing its economic power.
And for all our English learners, take a moment to review the key vocabulary we learned here. Sanction, to impose, to lift, secondary sanction, tariff, embargo, and economic diplomacy. Try to use these words in your own sentences, maybe write them down or practice them with a partner. The more you connect real-world issues to English learning, the faster your understanding will grow.
That's absolutely true, Julia. In the next part, we'll go deeper into how these sanctions were structured and how they worked, what exact rules were made, who was targeted, and what results came from them. But for now, this gives us a clear picture of the why, the reasoning behind Trump's decision to sanction Russian oil from the American perspective.
Now that we understand why the Trump administration decided to sanction Russian oil, it is important to explain how these sanctions actually worked. Understanding the mechanisms gives us insight into the tools countries use to influence others. When we talk about mechanisms, we mean the specific rules, restrictions, and steps taken to enforce sanctions. In simple words, this is how the US put its economic plan into action to target Russia's oil industry and reduce its global influence.
That's right, Julia. Sanctions are not just a single rule, they are a series of actions and laws designed to limit specific activities. In the case of Russian oil, the Trump administration targeted major Russian oil companies, such as Rosneft and Lukoil. These companies were central to Russia's energy exports. By restricting their ability to do business internationally, the U.S. aimed to reduce Russia's income and apply financial pressure. Think of it as a lock on a door. If you prevent these companies from selling oil freely, you effectively limit the money coming into the country.
Exactly. And one of the key mechanisms used was financial restrictions. For example, American banks were prohibited from providing loans, credit, or investment to the targeted Russian companies. This made it very difficult for these companies to fund new projects or maintain their operations. When a country loses access to international financing, it cannot easily expand production, modernize equipment, or sell oil at global prices. These financial restrictions were a crucial part of the U.S. strategy.
Yes, Julia. Another mechanism was the use of trade restrictions. These rules prevented Russian oil firms from selling oil to certain countries or engaging in certain types of international business. For instance, some contracts between Russian companies and foreign buyers were blocked or had to be carefully monitored to avoid breaking U.S. law. This created uncertainty in the market. Companies that wanted to buy Russian oil had to be very careful, or they risked being penalized by the U.S. government.
A very important point here is the concept of secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions target not only the main country or company, but also other companies and countries that continue to do business with the sanctioned party. For example, if a European company wanted to buy oil from a Russian firm under sanction, the U.S. could threaten to cut that company off from the American banking system or impose penalties. This mechanism greatly increased the effectiveness of sanctions because it extended the pressure beyond Russia itself.
Exactly, Julia. The secondary sanctions were a warning to the world. If you help Russia, you may face consequences too. This creates a strong incentive for other nations and companies to avoid dealing with sanctioned entities. Many companies decided to stop buying Russian oil or canceled contracts to remain compliant with U.S. rules. The fear of losing access to the dollar-based banking system was a major factor because most international trade happens in U.S. dollars. Losing access to that system could cause huge financial losses.
Another mechanism was export controls. The U.S. restricted the export of technology and equipment used in oil production to Russia. This meant that certain machinery or software necessary for oil extraction, refining, or transportation could not be sold to Russian companies. Without access to modern technology, Russia faced challenges in maintaining production efficiency and upgrading its oil facilities. This is a subtle but important way to reduce a country's long-term economic power.
Yes, Julia. And let's not forget legal enforcement. Sanctions are enforced through laws and executive orders. Violating these laws can result in fines, asset freezes, or legal action. The U.S. Treasury Department, especially its Office of Foreign Assets Control, monitors compliance and ensures that companies and individuals follow the rules. This legal framework makes sanctions credible and effective because companies know the consequences of breaking them are real and significant.
For our English learners, this section introduces many new vocabulary words: mechanism, restriction, secondary sanction, export control, compliance, and penalty. These are important words not only in politics, but also in business and law. By using them in context, you can understand how international relations work and also improve your professional English vocabulary.
Exactly. Another mechanism to mention is the use of price caps and transport restrictions. The U.S. and its allies sometimes limit the price at which Russian oil can be sold internationally. This reduces Russia's profits, even if some countries still buy their oil. Transportation restrictions, like banning shipments via certain shipping companies or ports, also reduce the ability to export oil. These combined mechanisms create multiple barriers that together put strong pressure on the target country.
And all these mechanisms are connected. When financial restrictions are combined with trade limits, secondary sanctions, export controls, and legal enforcement, the result is a comprehensive system that targets multiple points in the oil business. This makes it very difficult for Russian oil companies to operate normally in the global market. The idea is to limit income, reduce influence, and encourage political change, all without using military action.
Another interesting mechanism is communication and warning. Before implementing sanctions, the U.S. usually informs companies and other countries about upcoming rules. This gives them a chance to comply, adjust contracts, or avoid penalties. By giving warnings, the sanctions appear fair and transparent. It also increases the pressure on companies to act carefully, because failing to comply can result in serious consequences.
Exactly, Adam. In short, the mechanisms of the sanctions are a mix of direct action, targeting Russian companies, restricting trade, controlling technology exports, and indirect action, influencing other countries and companies through secondary sanctions and financial pressure. Together, these create a strong economic tool that can shape behavior on a global scale.
For our listeners, it is important to note that these mechanisms are not unique to Russia. They are part of the modern toolkit of international diplomacy. Countries like the United States use similar methods to influence Iran, North Korea, or even international organizations in certain situations. The key is understanding how these tools work, targeting financial flows, controlling exports, and enforcing rules through legal and economic pressure.
Exactly, Adam. And for English learners, this section also helps practice complex ideas in simple English. You can explain a mechanism as a way to do something, or the process used to make something happen. For example, we can say, the mechanism of the sanctions was to reduce Russia's oil revenue. Simple words, but they convey a big idea. Repeating these patterns helps learners discuss politics, economics, or global news in clear English.
Yes, Julia. And before we move to the next section, which will discuss the effects and impacts of the sanctions on Russia, let's quickly summarize what we learned here. Sanctions are not a single action. They are a system of mechanisms. These include financial restrictions, trade limits, secondary sanctions, export controls, legal enforcement, price caps, and warnings. All of these combined were used by the Trump administration to target Russia's oil industry and reduce its influence in the world.
That's right, Adam. And understanding these mechanisms is important because it shows how countries use economic tools to influence global events. It also shows how real-world politics is connected to language and vocabulary. Words like restriction, enforcement, and compliance may seem complicated, but in context, they are very understandable and useful for learners.
Exactly. And as we continue in the next section, we'll see the real-world results of these mechanisms, how they affected Russia's economy, oil production, and international trade. By understanding both the reasons and the mechanisms, you as listeners will have a complete picture of this complex topic, while also improving your English vocabulary and comprehension.
Now that we have discussed the mechanisms of the sanctions, it is important to understand their real-world effects and impacts on Russia. Sanctions are not just rules on paper. They create consequences that can be felt by governments, companies, and even ordinary people. When the Trump administration imposed sanctions on Russian oil, it affected multiple parts of the Russian economy. From production and export to revenue and investment, almost every sector connected to energy experienced pressure.
That's right, Julia. One of the first effects was on oil revenue. Russia earns billions of dollars every year from selling oil abroad, and this money is a key part of the government budget. When sanctions restricted trade and financing, Russia's oil companies could sell less oil or had to sell it at lower prices. This meant less income for the government. Less revenue affects social programs, infrastructure projects, and even the salaries of public workers. The impact is economic, but also political, because citizens notice changes in their daily lives.
Exactly, Adam. Another effect was on foreign investment. Many international companies were hesitant to invest in Russian oil projects because of the risk of breaking US sanctions. These restrictions limited technology transfer, modernization, and exploration of new oil fields. Over time, this slows down Russia's ability to expand its energy production and remain competitive in the global market. Without investment and advanced technology, long-term growth becomes difficult.
Yes, Julia. The sanctions also created uncertainty in the global market. When buyers, investors, and companies are unsure about the rules or penalties, they often reduce activity to avoid risk. This uncertainty affects prices. In some cases, it can even raise global oil prices because people are worried about supply shortages. While Russia may lose revenue, the rest of the world can feel indirect consequences through higher energy costs.
A very important point is the effect on Russian companies themselves. Many oil firms faced restrictions on borrowing money from international banks or accessing foreign currency accounts. They had to adjust budgets, delay projects, or even cancel contracts. Some smaller companies struggled to survive. The sanctions created a ripple effect across industries that depended on oil, transportation, manufacturing, and energy services, in making the overall economy less stable.
Yes, Julia. And let's talk about secondary effects as well. Companies in Europe or Asia that previously traded with Russian oil had to rethink their strategies. They had to either find new suppliers or risk facing US penalties. This affected not only Russian exports, but also the global supply chain. Countries dependent on Russian oil had to pay more or search for alternative sources, creating economic stress in multiple regions.
Exactly. And from a political perspective, sanctions also create pressure on government decisions. Russian leaders had to respond to economic challenges caused by reduced revenue and limited access to global markets. Sometimes this means implementing new domestic policies, like increasing taxes, cutting public spending, or adjusting energy policies. The goal of sanctions is to create enough pressure that the targeted government changes its behavior or policy decisions.
Another impact is on public perception and citizen life. Ordinary Russians may notice changes in fuel prices, heating costs, or availability of imported goods. While sanctions target companies and government revenue, the effects often reach everyday citizens. This indirect pressure is part of why sanctions are considered a tool of influence. It encourages both leaders and populations to reconsider policies or actions that the sanctioning country opposes.
Yes, Adam. And let's not forget the long-term economic challenges. Sanctions can slow down technological development, limit access to global markets, and reduce competitiveness. For an energy-dependent country like Russia, this can be very significant. Over time, reduced investment, delayed modernization, and trade restrictions can impact national growth, employment, and overall prosperity. These are strategic goals for sanctioning countries to weaken economic strength in a controlled, non-military way.
Another effect to consider is oil production strategy. Russian companies had to adjust how they produce and sell oil. Some companies focused more on domestic sales instead of exports. Others sought new markets in countries less concerned about US sanctions. While this shows adaptability, it also means changing business plans, logistics, and international partnerships, which can be costly and complex.
For English learners, this section also introduces important vocabulary: revenue, investment, uncertainty, ripple effect, competitiveness, adaptability, and domestic policies. These words help describe economic and political effects in a global context. Using these words in sentences or discussions can improve both your language and understanding of world affairs.
Absolutely, Julia. And it is also important to understand that the effects of sanctions are not immediate. They often happen over months or years. Governments, companies, and citizens gradually feel the impact, which makes sanctions a long-term tool of influence. That's why studying sanctions is useful. It helps learners connect economics, politics, and language in a meaningful way.
Another indirect impact is on international relationships. Sanctions can push the targeted country to seek new allies or strengthen relations with countries not following the sanctions. For example, Russia increased partnerships with China and other nations to maintain oil sales and investments. These shifts change global politics and trade patterns, showing how one economic decision can affect diplomacy worldwide.
Yes, Julia. And from a learning perspective, understanding these impacts helps English learners explain cause and effect relationships. For example, you can say, sanctions reduced Russia's oil revenue, which forced companies to adjust production, and this affected global oil prices. Simple sentences like this use real-world content to practice English while discussing complex topics.
Exactly. So, to summarize the main effects, sanctions on Russian oil reduced government revenue, limited foreign investment, created uncertainty in global markets, pressured Russian companies, affected citizens indirectly, slowed long-term economic growth, and influenced international relationships. Each of these impacts shows how interconnected the global economy is and why energy is such a powerful tool in world politics.
And for our listeners, this is also a moment to reflect on English vocabulary. Words like impact, restriction, pressure, consequence, ripple effect, and adaptation are all useful to describe global events. Practicing these words in context will help you speak and write about news, economics, and international politics in clear and confident English.
Yes, Adam. Understanding both the reasons for sanctions and their effects gives a complete picture of modern diplomacy and economic policy. It also shows how decisions in one part of the world can have wide-ranging consequences elsewhere. By following topics like this in English, you not only learn language, but also improve your knowledge of global events, which is essential for learners who want to discuss world news confidently.
Exactly, Julia. And in the next section, we'll discuss how these sanctions affected global oil markets and prices. That part will help listeners understand the bigger picture, how a single policy decision in one country can influence economies and daily lives worldwide.
Now that we have looked closely at how sanctions affected Russia, it is important to understand how these sanctions impacted other countries and the global oil market. When one major oil supplier faces restrictions, countries that rely on that oil have to adjust quickly. For example, India and China, which are large consumers of oil, responded in different ways. Some of them continued to buy Russian oil at discounted prices, while others reduced their purchases or sought alternative sources. This shows how interconnected the world's energy market is.
Exactly, Julia. When one large supplier like Russia is disrupted, other suppliers often step in to fill the gap. Countries may turn to oil from the Middle East, Africa, or even North and South America. Pipelines and shipping routes also play a critical role in redirecting oil flows. For example, if a pipeline in Europe carries less Russian oil, companies may increase shipments from other countries. This shift in oil supply can change prices and affect the global economy. It is important for English learners to understand words like supply chain, pipeline, and discount price, because they describe how oil moves and how markets adjust.
Yes, Adam. The term supply chain refers to the system that moves goods from the producer to the consumer. In the oil market, the supply chain includes drilling, refining, shipping, pipelines, and distribution to customers. When sanctions disrupt Russia's oil, the supply chain has to adapt. Countries and companies have to find new suppliers, adjust shipping schedules, and sometimes pay higher prices to secure oil. This process is not simple, and even small changes can affect energy prices worldwide.
Another important effect is on oil pricing. When Russian oil is restricted, Some countries may sell it at a discount to attract buyers. A discount price means the oil is sold for less than the usual market rate. This can influence global oil prices because cheaper oil may compete with other suppliers. At the same time, countries that cannot access Russian oil may have to pay higher prices for alternative sources. These changes create a ripple effect throughout the global market.
Exactly. This ripple effect can be seen in Europe, Asia, and even the United States. For example, when European countries reduced their purchases of Russian oil, they increased imports from Norway, Saudi Arabia, or other regions. Shipping routes, pipelines, and ports had to adjust to new flows of oil. This caused changes in transportation costs, fuel prices, and even trade balances between nations. The global oil market is like a large interconnected web. When one strand is pulled, the others shift too.
Yes, Julia. And for English learners, this section introduces many useful verbs that describe economic changes. Words like to reduce, to increase, to shift, to disrupt, and to adjust are very important. For example, we can say, sanctions reduced Russia's oil exports, or other countries shifted their purchases to new suppliers. Using these verbs helps learners clearly describe cause and effect relationships in economics and politics.
Exactly, Adam. Another example is, the global oil market adjusted to changes in supply and demand. Here, adjusted describes how the market responds to events like sanctions. Other verbs include to compete, to influence, and to replace. These action words are critical because they allow learners to explain how one event can impact many countries, companies, and people worldwide.
Another interesting point is how buyers respond strategically. Some countries, like India and China, were able to buy discounted Russian oil, increasing their stockpiles while lowering costs. At the same time, Europe sought alternative suppliers at market prices, which sometimes increased their costs. These different strategies show how countries balance economic efficiency, political pressure, and energy security in a complex global market.
Yes, Adam. And it's important for learners to notice that these effects are both short-term and long-term. Short-term effects include changes in daily oil flows, discounts, and shipping adjustments. Long-term effects can include shifts in trade partnerships, investments in alternative energy, or construction of new pipelines. The global oil market is dynamic, and any major disruption, like sanctions on Russia, can have consequences for months or even years.
Exactly. So when we talk about global oil markets, we can summarize key vocabulary for English learners: supply chain, pipeline, discount price, export, import, market adjustment, and verbs like to reduce, to impose, to shift, to adjust, and to disrupt. Understanding these words helps learners describe global events accurately and clearly in English.
And from a learning perspective, it's useful to practice using these words in real sentences. For example, sanctions on Russian oil disrupted the supply chain, or China shifted its purchases to take advantage of discounted oil prices. Practicing these sentences strengthens both vocabulary and comprehension of complex global topics.
Exactly, Julia. By understanding how other countries respond and how global oil markets shift, learners gain a deeper knowledge of international relations, trade, and economics. It also improves English skills in discussing cause and effect, strategy, and global trends, all in a clear, structured way.
So to summarize this section, sanctions on Russian oil influenced not only Russia, but also other countries and the global market. Countries like India and China adjusted their purchases, pipelines and shipping routes were redirected, and global oil prices were affected. Learners should focus on verbs like to reduce, to shift, and to impose, because these action words help explain changes in the economy clearly.
Exactly. And with this understanding, our listeners are better prepared to analyze global news in English, connect vocabulary with real events, and describe economic changes confidently. In the next section, we'll explore the responses from Europe and the United States and how sanctions affected diplomacy and trade policies worldwide.
Now that we have discussed the effects of sanctions on Russia and the global oil market, it is important to understand the limitations and challenges of this strategy. Sanctions are powerful tools, but they are not perfect. Even though the goal is to pressure Russia to change its behavior, the reality is more complicated. Russia can find alternative buyers, such as countries willing to purchase discounted oil. In addition, the global oil market is very large and flexible. Other suppliers or adjustments in production can absorb the changes caused by sanctions, which may reduce their overall effectiveness.
Exactly, Julia. Sanctions are often described as a blunt tool. They apply broad pressure, but they cannot guarantee a specific outcome. For example, if the U.S. imposes sanctions on Russian oil, it may reduce Russia's income temporarily. But Russia can still sell oil to countries not following the sanctions. Companies and nations often find ways to work around restrictions, which means the intended effect may be less than expected. For English learners, this is a good example of cause and effect. If sanctions are imposed, then Russia may find new buyers.
Yes, Adam. And another challenge is unintended effects. While sanctions are meant to punish or influence one country, they can affect other countries and companies as well. For example, European nations may have to pay more for energy, or global oil prices may rise. Sometimes citizens in the sanctioning country also feel higher fuel or commodity prices. These are indirect consequences that are difficult to predict. In simple terms, sanctions do not only hit the target, they can create ripple effects worldwide.
Exactly. Let's give a simple example. Suppose a country imposes sanctions on a major oil exporter. If the exporter cannot sell oil to certain countries, other buyers might offer lower prices to purchase it. This helps the exporting country continue its sales, even if revenue is slightly lower. Meanwhile, countries relying on alternative sources may face higher costs or supply challenges. So the intended effect, to weaken the exporter, may be partially offset. For English learners, this is a perfect example to practice if A, then B statements. If the exporter finds new buyers, then the effect of sanctions is reduced.
Yes, Adam. Another limitation is time. Sanctions usually do not produce immediate results. The effects can take months or years to appear. Governments may implement internal policies to adapt to financial pressure. Citizens may adjust consumption. Companies may find new markets, and alternative energy sources may be developed. This means that while sanctions are meant to create change, it is not always fast or guaranteed.
Another important point is resilience of the targeted country. Russia, for example, has significant natural resources, energy infrastructure, and economic partnerships. Even with sanctions, it can adjust strategies, build new alliances, or shift trade routes. This makes sanctions less effective if the targeted country is resourceful and adaptable. For English learners, noticing the verbs to adjust, to shift, to find, and to absorb is useful because they describe action and adaptation.
Exactly. And this brings us back to cause and effect. When analyzing sanctions or any policy, it is helpful to think logically. If the US imposes sanctions, then Russia may take certain actions. If Russia takes those actions, then the global market may adjust. This simple structure helps learners explain complex international events in a clear and organized way, using English sentences effectively.
Yes, Julia. And one more example of unintended consequences is on global diplomacy. Sometimes sanctions can create tension between allies. Countries that continue trading with Russia may face criticism, while those complying may face higher costs. This can affect political relationships, trade agreements, and negotiations in ways that were not originally planned.
Exactly. So, while sanctions are an important tool in modern international relations, they are not perfect. Limitations include the ability of the target country to find alternative buyers, the flexibility of the global market, unintended economic consequences, and the time needed for effects to appear. Understanding these challenges helps learners see the complexity behind policies often discussed in the news.
And for English learners, practicing the if A then B structure is very helpful. For example, if sanctions reduce exports, then oil prices may rise globally. Or, if Russia finds alternative buyers, then the sanctions may not fully achieve the intended effect. Using these sentences helps learners discuss economics and politics clearly and logically.
Yes, Adam. So to summarize this section, sanctions are not a perfect strategy. They are a blunt tool with limitations. The target country may adapt, the global market may absorb changes, unintended consequences may occur, and results often take time. By thinking in terms of cause and effect, learners can describe these challenges effectively in English while understanding the real-world context.
Exactly. And in the next section, we will discuss the responses from Europe and the United States, how governments, companies, and policymakers reacted to the challenges and tried to strengthen the impact of the sanctions. Before we continue with more content, Julia, I think it's important for our listeners to pause for a moment and focus on key vocabulary and phrases we have used throughout this podcast. Learning these words will help you not only understand today's topic about Russian oil sanctions, but also discuss global news and economics more confidently in English.
Absolutely, Adam. Let's start with the word sanctions. A sanction is a rule or action taken by one country to influence the behavior of another country. For example, we said, sanctions reduced Russia's oil exports. Listeners, repeat mentally or aloud, sanctions.
Next is tariff. A tariff is a tax on goods coming from another country. For example, the government imposed a tariff on imported oil to protect local producers. Repeat, tariff.
Another word is export. Export means to sell goods to another country. For instance, Russia exports oil to many countries around the world. Say it with me. Export.
And the opposite is import, which means to bring goods into a country from another country. Example, China imports oil from Russia and the Middle East. Repeat, import.
A very important phrase we discussed is secondary sanction. This is a sanction that targets not only the main country, but also other countries or companies that continue to do business with the sanctioned party. For example, the US applied secondary sanctions to prevent foreign companies from buying Russian oil. Repeat, secondary sanction.
Next is revenue. Revenue is the money a government or company earns. For example, oil revenue is a major source of income for the Russian government. Say it with me, revenue.
And finally, the word pivot. Pivot means to change direction or strategy. For example, Russia had to pivot to new buyers after sanctions were imposed. Repeat, pivot.
Great, Julia. Now let's give our listeners a short practice dialogue using these words in context. Listen carefully, and you can repeat mentally or aloud.
I read that sanctions on Russian oil have affected global exports. Do you know how?
Yes, Julia. Some countries had to pivot and find new suppliers because they could not import oil from Russia.
I see. Did these sanctions reduce Russia's revenue?
Exactly. Revenue decreased because fewer countries were buying their oil. Secondary sanctions also made it risky for some companies to trade with Russia.
And tariffs also played a role, right?
Yes. Tariffs on imports encouraged some countries to look for local oil instead of relying on Russian exports.
Perfect. Listeners, you can practice this dialogue with a friend or even repeat it aloud by yourself. Using these words in sentences helps you remember them and understand how to use them in real-world news or business contexts.
Exactly. To summarize, today we focused on sanctions, tariff, export, import, secondary sanction, revenue, and pivot. Practice saying them, making sentences, and understanding their meanings. This will strengthen your English and your ability to discuss economics and global events.
Yes, Adam. And by repeating words, using them in sentences, and practicing dialogue, listeners will improve both their vocabulary and their confidence in speaking English about complex topics. Now, Adam, before we finish today's episode, let's take a moment to review and reinforce the key points we discussed. This will help our listeners remember and use the English vocabulary and ideas we have shared.
Absolutely, Julia. First, let's recall why the Trump administration introduced sanctions on Russian oil. Sanctions were meant to reduce Russia's revenue, limit its influence in the global oil market, and encourage policy changes by applying economic pressure. They are a tool used in international relations to influence behavior without using military force.
Exactly. And how do these sanctions work? They use several mechanisms. For example, financial restrictions prevent banks from providing loans to Russian oil companies. Trade restrictions limit who can buy or sell oil. Secondary sanctions target other countries or companies that continue to trade with Russia. Export controls stop the sale of technology needed for oil production. All of these combined create strong economic pressure.
And what are the main effects of these sanctions? Well, Russian oil revenue decreased, foreign investment was limited, companies had to adjust their strategies, and global oil prices and supply chains shifted. Other countries, like India and China, responded by finding alternative suppliers or buying discounted oil. The sanctions also created unintended consequences in the global market and required time to show full effects.
But Adam, it's important to remember that sanctions have limitations. Russia can pivot to alternative buyers, the global market can absorb changes, and sometimes sanctions produce unintended effects. They are a blunt tool and may not fully achieve the desired results. Understanding these limitations helps us think critically about economic policies.
Yes, Julia. And now, listeners, let's reinforce your understanding with a few rhetorical questions. Think about them and answer mentally. What happens when oil revenue drops? What is a tariff? What is a secondary sanction? How can other countries respond if a large supplier is restricted? Why might sanctions take a long time to show effects? So to summarize this section, we reviewed why sanctions were introduced, how they work, their effects on Russia and the global market, and their limitations. Then, we reinforced learning with questions and a short quiz to help listeners remember key vocabulary and ideas.
Yes, Adam. Listeners, try to repeat this review in your own words. Explain what you learned to yourself or a friend. This will strengthen both your English and your understanding of global affairs.
As we wrap up today's podcast, Julia, it's clear that understanding international issues like sanctions on Russian oil is not only interesting, but also very helpful for English learners.
Absolutely, Adam. By discussing real-world events, listeners learn useful vocabulary, phrases used in global affairs, and how to think critically about cause and effect. This makes learning English practical and connected to current events.
We encourage our listeners to keep watching and listening to more podcasts on global topics, explained in simple English. Each episode will help you improve your vocabulary, comprehension, and confidence in speaking about world events.
Yes. So, dear listeners, keep listening, keep practicing, and we'll meet in the next episode. Remember, learning English is a journey, and every step with real-world topics makes it more meaningful and fun.